You want to open your Bibles to Romans 12. In the outset of our seminar yesterday, I always give the caveat that it's becoming a stronger and stronger belief with me that the New Testament assumes the bell curve of normalcy. It really doesn't go into a lot of depth talking about things that we would consider to be clinically diagnosable, because people who aren't responsible for their behavior aren't accountable for their behavior. So the New Testament writers didn't spend a lot of time talking about things that people couldn't control. So when you get into the ethics, the holiness code, the things God tells us to do and how God tells us to act, there is almost a given, it's almost a granted that you're responsible for that. And so with that being in the background, then everything that God says we should do as Christians, the way Christians should live, probably you could put it in one of two categories, or put them in the same category, is that spiritual maturity and people who are behaving mentally healthy, that looks a lot alike. That doesn't mean we don't have flaws, that doesn't mean we don't have problems, that doesn't mean we don't have certain difficulties. But when you talk about not the maladaptive behavior, but the true mental illness, then we got the ability to make changes. Now, if you get into the maladaptive behavior, then if it doesn't look spiritually mature, it's probably not socially, emotionally, or psychologically healthy. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's look at Romans 12. In Romans 12, Paul has made an argument with not really an argument, he's going to visit this congregation of Gentile Christians who are attending a congregation with Jewish Christians. And what had happened in the first century is that the Jewish Christians had elevated ceremonial cleanliness to righteousness. That's what happened in the church at Galatia. And so they were teaching kind of a gospel plus one. Oh yeah, you're a Christian, but you're not a real Christian unless you do this. And we're guilty of that in everything that we do. When we get people together, we have well-meaning people who want you to know, well, there's probably a better way to do that. We do that everywhere. Somebody says, Lonnie, are you a hunter? Yes, I'm a hunter. Rifle hunter or bow hunter? Bow hunter. Use a compound bow or a recurve bow? Compound bow. You shoot with your fingers or shoot with a release. And all those differences of how you hunt mean you're either in the club or not in the club. You do the same thing with everything you do. You drive a Ford or a Chevy. I drive a Toyota. 450,000 miles on my other truck. Anyway, we always try to make, and so the Jewish Christians were saying, you Gentiles, you're not as special as we are because we were God's chosen people. I've got a Jewish friend. He was a medic with our team for years, a retired major in the Army. He has a yarmulke that he wears underneath his helmet. We've had lots of biblical discussions. He was going to be a rabbi before he went into the military. I said, Rich, you may be God's chosen people, but he loves us Gentiles better because he lets us eat bacon. I'm just saying, But, and he can't argue with that. But anyway, but the Jews said, if you're not doing this, you're not a real Christian. And the Gentiles said, well, you were God's chosen people. You didn't recognize the Messiah when he came. Well, Paul writes this letter to say, everybody that's ever walked on the planet's got a sin problem. And the only way you solve that sin problem is by the grace of God. And after he establishes that, Romans chapter 12, he's going to say, this is how these redeemed people, these imperfect people who've been justified by God, 28 times between Romans and Galatians, he'll use the word justified. 26 of those times, the word justified means not guilty. 2 of those times, it means made righteous. Well, this is how people who are made righteous, who are justified. Romans 12, this is how we get along with each other. Romans 13, this is how you get along with civil government. And in Romans 14, this is how you get along when your religious traditions don't agree, when you want to argue about things that are debatable. And so he basically takes these last, what we call in the English Bible, 3 chapters, and talks about how we should interact with one another. And I think I can make the argument that Romans 12 describes spiritually mature people. And as we behave more and more spiritually mature, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, that probably makes us behave pretty well emotionally and psychologically healthy. At least that's my view on it. And so we start in Romans 12:1. Oh, and I'm sorry. And keep in mind these two systems. We talked about emotional intelligence yesterday. Do I recognize my emotions? Can I deal with the animal that's me? And then based on understanding my own emotions, can I self-regulate? Delayed gratification, impulse control, and motivation. Am I willing to work hard in uncomfortable situations to get a long-term result? I've got a sign in my garage gym. It says, I do things that you want, so I can do things that you can't. Call that intentional adversity. Sometimes we put up with difficult circumstances just to learn that we can do that. And so once I understand me, once I don't quit just because it's hard or just because I don't like it, once I have that emotional control, then I have emotional insight. I can see that in other people. I call that empathy. And so once I recognize emotions in others, then I can adjust to other people from their perspective. What is it that you need? What is it that I'm not being selfish, being selfless? And then once you put all that together, you've got a pretty healthy interaction. Emotional intelligence is the marker for success. It's not your ACT, it's not your SAT, it's not your GPA, but whether or not you're emotionally intelligent. There are people with 160 IQ, and they all work for people who have 100 IQ. Because C students rule the world, because they have people sense. And then you get into Stephen Glenn's idea that if you're going to be a self-reliant, if you're going to be an adult, if you're going to leave home and establish your own place, you have to have 3 perceptions. I'm capable, I'm significant, and my choices affect my outcomes. And then you have to have 4 skills. Intrapersonal skills, understanding me. Interpersonal skills, understanding you. Systemic skills, understanding us. And then judgmental skills. What do I use to make decisions about good, bad, right, and wrong? And so with those kind of theories in the background, listen to Romans 12. Romans 12:1. I beseech you, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. Paul is making an ask. He's asking the people here, who he's talked about God's love and God's mercy and God's grace and our faith and justification and sanctification and righteousness. He says, I'm going to ask you to do something big. Now, typically when you ask for something big, you kind of want to sell your case. You know, this teenager wants a later curfew. This teenager wants a new car. Mom and Dad, have you looked at my grades? Have you seen my rooms clean? Have you seen I've fed the hamster? Have you noticed I hadn't spent as much time on the internet? You know, Paul says, I'm going to ask you to give up you and become a sacrifice. Now, this is not going to be a sacrifice where you're burned up. This is going to be a sacrifice where you're burned out. This is where you live life in service of others. Your life is going to become a sacrificial expression to God. And Paul says, and what I'm going to use as my leverage to ask you this is I want you to look at the mercies of God. Paul will rarely, he'll talk about the wrath of God in Romans 1, but Paul will rarely motivate an audience with what God can do to us. He'll always talk about what God has done for us. And that's going to be our measure. If God treated you this way, even though you didn't deserve us, how should you treat other people? So Paul says, I'm going to ask you this based on the mercies of God. And the ask is that you give yourself as a living sacrifice. Now, how do you become a living sacrifice? Verse 2, therefore do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Paul says, if you change the way you think, you'll change the way you live. If you change the way you think about God, you change the way you think about other people, you change the way you think about yourself, it will change the way you live. And instead of using the model and this idea of don't be conformed to the world, it's literally the idea of taking a ring with a signet on it and stamping it into something and making a negative impression. He says, don't let the negative impression of the world, don't let that image of the world be put into you, but rub that out. Don't be conformed, but transform it. Smooth that clay back out and press a new image in it, and that image be the image of God. I beseech you, by the mercies of God, be a living sacrifice. Don't be put in the world's mold or the world's pattern, the world's image, but be transformed. And that transformation comes by changing the way you think. And then when he talks about changed thinkers, when he talks about the way people who change their minds, and that's a cognitive behavioral therapy. The way you think affects the way you feel. The way you think and feel affects the way you behave. What you think about the way you behave affects the way you feel. It kind of becomes this cycle that goes every direction. It's cognitive behavioral therapy, and this is cognitive spiritual therapy. Paul says you change the way you think and you change the way you live. Notice the first thing he talks about, thought patterns. Verse 3, for I say through the grace given me to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly as God dealt to each of you a measure of faith. He says when you start interacting with other people, love your neighbor as yourself. The first person you've got to get in check is not your neighbor, but yourself. And once I have a proper balance with myself, once I get that under control, if I have the proper view of my worth, my worthiness, and my worthlessness, guess how I get to treat other people? I can't get along in a marriage. I can't get along in a system. I can't get along in a company. I can't get along in a community until I have myself under control. And that self-awareness, intrapersonal skills, the emotional intelligence, until I get that under control, I can't. Now, once I get that under control, what happens to me? I blend into a system. For I say through the grace given me, everyone among you, don't think more highly of himself than he ought to think, but to think soberly as God has given each one a measure of faith. For as we have many members, but one body, but all the members don't have the same function, so we being many are one body in Christ, individually members of one another, having then gifts differing according to the grace that is given us, let us use them. Paul says, now once you understand you start realizing that you are connected to other people, and that connection becomes interdependent. Not independent, I'm doing my own thing. Not dependent, I don't and I can't and it's your fault. It's interdependent. Had a group of kids on the ropes course one time, and we did an exercise that involved interdependence. I said, somebody define interdependence, and this little girl said, we depend with each other. Not we depend on each other, but we depend with each other. And I like that as a definition. So Paul says, once you understand who you are, once you change the way you think about you, change the way you think about God, and change the way you think about others, you then have a measure not to think more highly of yourself than you ought to think, but soberly based on what God has gifted you, and that gifting from God allows you to connect with other people. So now this is systemic skills, intrapersonal skills, interpersonal skills, and systemic skills. And then when I recognize my role, now specifically he's going to talk about the role in the body. He's going to talk about how these people interconnected with each other as children of God and as fellow believers baptized into the same body, how they interact in the church system. But the same is true. What's your function in the family? What's your function in community? What's your function in church? What's your function on a team? You know, if I were to ask you what's the most important part of your car, we could argue automotive theory. We could tell the teenage girls it's called the brake. It's the pedal on the left. We could talk about lights, and we could talk about universal joints, and we could talk about fuel injectors. But if I start home to Alabama this afternoon and there's a pop-up thunderstorm and I don't have a $16 piece of rubber that does this, I won't be able to drive my truck. The most important part of that car is the part that's not working when I need it to work. The most important part in your family, the most important part in this fellowship, the most important part of community or a company is, hey, if I'm not doing my job, if I'm not fulfilling my role, and just because we have a different function doesn't mean we have a different value. And a lot of times we think function and value are sometimes argue with each other. You have a value simply because you have a function. And that's it. It doesn't have to be a specific function. My windshield wipers don't cost as much as my transmission. And the transmission may not be as important as the computer programming system in my new car. But what happens is when one of those doesn't function properly, it affects the whole system. So Paul says, in order for you to be spiritually mature, and in order for you to be mentally healthy, you've got to learn how to get along with family, and then with society and with community. And I notice what he talks about in understanding what our roles are. Verse 6, having then gifts differing according to the grace that is given to us, let us use them. You've got to function. You've got something to do in your home, in your family, in your congregation, in your community, and people who are non-functioning in social systems are dysfunctional. They don't contribute, they don't help, they don't share, they don't give, they don't incorporate themselves, they don't have integration. And you'll notice that mentally ill people are disintegrated. They're disintegrated from society, they're disintegrated from each other, they're disintegrated from family, and people who are spiritually immature don't fellowship with the church, they don't attend, they don't do well, and oftentimes that spiritual immaturity disintegrates them from God. So you've got to function, you've got a job to do. I'm capable, I'm significant, I can influence my outcomes. If you're not close to people, sometimes it's because we're not making the efforts to be close to people. You know, what we teach in our young families class at home, we call them the life builders. Our motto is attention, belonging, and support. And every now and then we give a survey to the class. Hey, get a card out, write down attention, belonging, and support. And on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the worst and 10 being the best, how much attention, how much belonging, how much support did you get from our group this year? And then we go back and say, hey, write down on a piece of paper attention, belonging, and support. On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the worst, 10 being the best, how much attention did you give anybody this year? How much belonging did you create in someone? How much support did you give? And you'll find that most of the people who don't feel like they get it aren't giving it. This has got to be reciprocity. It's got to be an interchange. So he says, you've got these gifts, so use them. And then he's going to specify some specific gifts. If it's prophecy, do it in proportion to your faith. If it's ministry, and ministry is a word that means serving. It doesn't mean up front, out loud with a title. If it's ministry, then do it in your ministering. If it's teaching, in teaching. And then look at these functions in verse 8. Exhortation, giving, and mercy. How many people thought that encouraging, giving, and being forgiving was leadership in the church? When Paul talks about gifts in the church, yeah, he talks about prophecy, and he talks about ministering, and he talks about teaching, but he also says you can measure the giftedness of somebody by how well they encourage, by how well they give, and by how well they forgive. And so I start looking at people who are mentally healthy and spiritually mature. I start measuring, hey, is this person an encourager, or do they always need encouragement? Is this person giving, or is he always asking? And is this person forgiving, or do they hold grudges? Do they have problems with other people? So again, spiritually mature, mentally healthy seems to be on the same track. And then he talks about interpersonal skills. He talks about how we treat each other. And you'll notice that there's no antisocial behavior here. There's not going to be any narcissism here. There's not going to be any personality disorders here. Because notice what he says, verse 9, let love be without hypocrisy. When I love you, it's not because you can do something for me. When I treat you nice and treat you well, it's not because there's any advantageous thing for me. I'm going to love you without hypocrisy. That means the church doesn't exist with tears. There's no tears in heaven. That's T-I-E-R-S, not T-E-A-R-S. Okay? There's not the in crowd and the out crowd. This is not like the high school cafeteria where you have your popular people, your unpopular people, and your worthy people and your unworthy people. No. We love people without hypocrisy. I'm not doing what I do for you because you can do something for me. I'm doing what I do for you because you need it. Love is the intentional and, if necessary, personally costly investment to the good of another. It doesn't require reciprocity. I'm not trying to make an investment, and it doesn't even require that you deserve it. So let love be without hypocrisy. And then he says, in order to really be spiritually mature, you got to abhor what is evil and cling to what is good. And that's pretty binary. I know we hear a lot in our society about, non-binary thinking and that kind of stuff. There's a couple of things in life that they're yes or no. I ask people all the time about trust. And by the way, you choose who you trust by whether or not you think they're selfish. Most people don't connect those two things, but if you think somebody is not selfish, you trust them. If you think somebody is selfish, you don't trust them. But I'll be counseling with a couple who's about to get married, and I can probably tell maybe they shouldn't be married. and you ask the guy to leave the room, and the little girl's sitting in the room, and you look at her and you go, do you trust this young man? And she goes, well, he's cute. No. That's a yes or no question. You trust or you don't trust. And if I ask you, do you trust this person, and you hesitate, you know what the answer is? You don't. Hey, let's go rock climbing. Lonnie, will this rope hold me? Well, 50-50, No, you don't get on a rope like that. Will this boat float? Man, that's yes or no. Do you love me? Yes or no? Do you hate what is evil? You can't flirt with evil. You can't hold hands with evil. You can't be friends with evil. It's got to be pretty binary. Things that God says are bad for me, that was the cool thing about the Jewish food laws. My friend Rich doesn't ever look at a piece of bacon and go, man, I wish I could try that. God told him as a Jew, and he still follows the old law, that it was unclean. And unclean to him means it's disgusting. And he wouldn't dare think about it. He's got a little pond that he lets me fish in. He's full of bass. I said, Rich, you got any catfish in your? No! Well, catfish are unclean. He wouldn't have them in his pond. I've got things I can't eat. I wear a glucose monitor on my arm. By the way, it's connected to my wife's phone. And so if I misbehave at lunch, her phone will beep, and she'll ask me, did you enjoy that banana pudding? And I'll not answer my phone. But anyway, when I see something I shouldn't eat, I want it. If I could have a Krispy Kreme donut, do y'all have Krispy Kreme donuts in Mississippi? I take a Krispy Kreme donut, put a pat of butter on it, melt it in the microwave, take a Wendy's Frosty, put it in the middle, and put honey on it. That's what I'd have for lunch right now if I could. There's stuff that if I eat will kill me, but I'd love to have some of it. A Jewish person saw what God said was unclean, and it was abhorrent to them. It would be you thinking about eating a roadkill armadillo. When you look at something and it's offensive to God, do you hate it, or do you walk by the table and go, boy, I'd like to have some of that? Abhor what is evil, cling to what is good. And people who can make those distinctions that this is not only bad, but bad for me, bad for us, and bad for me and God, then we are mature spiritually and we're probably emotionally healthy. Then he says, let love be without hypocrisy, abhor what is evil, cling to what is good, be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love, in honor, giving preference to one another. Basically, he's going to restate what he said in the Philippian letter, that you treat other people as if they are more special than you. And there's a principle here. And it's all over the New Testament. Once I was started talking about it, I find it everywhere. And it's the as-if principle. I'm going to treat you, I can superimpose what would it look like if I intentionally treated you as if I loved you. What would it look like if I could intentionally treat you as if I respected you? What would it look like in my marriage if I've been hurt or wounded and I could just intentionally treat you as if I forgave you? Now, I understand there's some things that wound us. I understand that for whatever reason, the things that happen to us, and for whatever reason, something clicks in our mind, and it's very, very difficult to get over. I don't know how that mechanism works. Sometimes people say things or don't say things, they do things or don't do things, and for whatever reason, you get this switch that's flipped. I'm not talking about being hypocritical. I'm talking about being intentional. I'm going to treat you as if I forgave you. What would that look like in repairing your relationship with anybody? I'm going to treat you as if you're more important than me. What would that look like if I just intentionally did that to everybody I ran into? Paul says, I want you to treat each other, be kindly affectionate one another, in brotherly love, giving preference to one another. Now, when that's difficult, when they don't deserve it, verse 12 says, or verse 11, not lagging in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. I treat you the way I treat you. It may be difficult, it may be inconvenient, and it may be uncomfortable, but I don't do it because of you, I do it because of Him. How would God have me treat you? If I can make those kind of intentional decisions, I'm spiritually mature, and I'm probably mentally healthy. Because mentally healthy people have the ability to see themselves in context from the other person's perspective. And then he talks about sharing. He talks about being patient in tribulation and continuing steadfast. He says you don't get to quit these situations, marriages, fellowships, friendships. You don't get to get out of an oath you made or a vow you took just because it's hard or harder than you thought it would be. Once you said you're going to do it, you do it, and you don't get to let your circumstances decide your faithfulness. Your faithfulness doesn't affect your circumstances, but your circumstances shouldn't affect your faithfulness. People who are spiritually mature live the as-if principle. And then the second thing to that is they live the even though principle. I have lunch or I have breakfast every Thursday with a young police officer named Cooper Houghton. Cooper's 6'4", weighs 325 pounds. He's also my jiu-jitsu workout partner, or he was till they retired me. That's a big lad. That's a lot of boy to feed breakfast to. And we were studying Romans, and when we got into Romans 12, we were talking about the as-if principle, and we got into the next verse. He goes, well, that's the even though principle. I treat you as if I love you. I treat you as if I forgave you. I treat you as if you're my brother. I treat you as if I respect you. And he says, and I treat you this way even though you don't treat me that way. Notice what he says in Romans 12. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. I'm going to treat you in spite of the way you treat me. Your treatment of me does not give me permission to treat you in a certain way. I'm going to bless and not curse. I'm going to rejoice with those who rejoice. I'm going to weep with those who weep. I'm going to be of the same mind toward one another. I'm not going to be haughty or narcissistic. I'm going to be humble, and I'm not going to be the smartest guy in the room. I'm not going to be wise in my own opinion. Now, if I understand who I am with that mindset, with that shift in consciousness where I'm not something special, then I'm not going to repay evil for evil. And I'm going to have regard for good things in the sight of all men. So I'm going to treat you the way I treat you, as if I love you, as if I respect you, as if I forgave you. And I'm going to treat you this way even though you're difficult, even though you're imperfect, even though you're hard to get along with. And so when you look at these systemic behaviors that Paul was asking these people who are redeemed and saved and sanctified, he said, if you'll treat each other this way in your fellowship, just think what would happen if we treated people that way in our home, in our communities, in our companies, on our sports teams, or wherever we ended up being. People who can't do these things are not mentally well. People who don't do these things are not spiritually mature. And so mental wellness and spiritual maturity go really, really hand in hand together. Now, the difficult thing is after he said all this, he's going to make one caveat. And that one caveat is going to be, if it is possible, as much as it depends on you, live at peace with all men. Now, I used to read that and it used to scare me to death. There's a comedian named Brian Regan. He's kind of a weird guy. He says, you're 8 years old, you're sitting in the living room, you're playing with Lego blocks, you're looking at a color TV, and a bear comes on TV and says, only you can prevent forest fires. That's a lot of pressure. I'm 8 years old. Why am I in charge of forest fires? Well, I used to read this verse, as much as possible, as much as it depends on you, live at peace. And I thought it was my job to be the peacemaker. Well, read this verse closely. As much as possible, sometimes it's not possible. And as much as it depends on you, sometimes it doesn't depend on me. That verse is part of the reason I came up with the idea that the Bible talks about the bell curve of normalcy. Because people who are operating outside that, narcissists and predators and sociopaths and psychopaths, I don't have to expose my family to their toxicity. Even Paul will put limits on behavior. Paul will say, if you want to be a member of the church, stop sleeping with that woman. And if you're going to sleep with that woman, you can't be a member of the church. Paul will say, mark those who cause division. Paul will say, look at somebody in your fellowship. They claim to be a Christian, but they're an extortioner or a drunkard or a reviler. Don't have anything to do with them. So there's a place where, and I mean in an extreme, not uncomfortable, not inconvenient, not difficult, not disruptive, but dangerous, physically, intellectually, emotionally, or spiritually. If it's not possible and it goes beyond your ability, there is a place where you can put some limits. And spiritually mature people and mentally healthy people also understand those limits. And then the last thing he's going to say is, beloved, don't avenge yourselves. It's not up to me to settle the score. If I wait to be happy when I've made you unhappy as you made me, then you're in charge of my happiness. If I wait for you to suffer as bad as I've suffered, then I'm waiting on your reaction for me to behave. He says, let that go. Just write that stuff off. Forgiveness is not about what you owe me, it's what I owe you. And so Paul simply says, don't avenge yourself. Let God handle that stuff. And depending on how you read the heaping coals of fire on their head, that was a sign of the Egyptian repentance. They'd walk around with a bowl of smoking coal on their head when they were demonstrating in public that they were sorry about something. If you treat me bad, it's probably because you don't value me or you don't think I'm worthwhile. And if I reciprocate that treatment, I've reinforced that I'm a jerk. When you think about turning the other cheek, if somebody thinks I'm done something bad enough, they have to slap me. And by the way, slapping someone is an insult. It's not an attack. So you can slap me all day and I have to fight back. That's not self-defense. That's retaliation. But if you think I'm worthless or you think my behavior makes me a jerk and you slap me and I slap you back, I reinforce that thought. This guy's got a short temper. He's short and has a short temper. But if you slap me and I go, if that made you feel better, here's the other one. I don't fight about things that are that little. I don't fight about things that are inconsequential. It may be hurtful, it may be damaging, it may be insulting, but if all of a sudden that's not a big deal to me, what happens to your evaluation of me? You've just slapped me because you think I'm a bad person and I didn't slap you back. You go, he may not be as bad as I thought he was. It just resets your interpersonal behaviors. And mentally unhealthy people always say their behavior caused this in me. They don't have agency, they don't have self-control. Spiritually mature people never blame other people's behavior for what they do or don't do. And then the last thing he's going to say, and this sets the bar high for being spiritually mature and mentally healthy, but it says, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Spiritually mature people, people who are mentally well, don't live their lives in a retaliation format. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Not do unto others as they do to you, not do unto others before they do to you, but mentally healthy people and spiritually mature people look at what do people need, not what do they deserve, and they always choose the needs. And even when you're misbehaving, oftentimes I look for, hey, what have they said, what have they done, and what does that behavior indicate that they need? And if I can respond to that need, I'm not overcoming evil with evil because that doesn't work. I'm going to overcome evil with good. I did a workshop at Vestavia Hills High School. They asked me to come talk to their incoming freshmen, and we did a 2-hour seminar with the book Grappling with Life. I had my friend Tyler Sperlin, who would demonstrate some stuff with the jiu-jitsu with football boys who thought they could hold this guy down. He's a 155-pound brown belt, and you can't hold him down. And he'd take your leg off and hand it to you. But anyway, we were doing this thing, and the last thing we did in the day is we played this game called Zombie Tag. And zombie tag's a weird thing. I don't know if you're familiar with zombie apocalypse or not. But the thing is, we had 245 kids, and we made a boundary in this room. You couldn't get outside the boundary, and said, we're going to play zombie tag. So what happens is this guy is it, and everybody he tags becomes it. And so you end up not with one it, but eventually everybody in the room's it. So we said go, and he tagged you, then you tag somebody, and then that person, and you start tagging people. We tagged 245 people in like 47 seconds. Everybody in the room got tagged, became an it. Now we're going to play second version of zombie tag. If somebody tags you, do nothing. Just freeze in place. And in the same amount of time, we tagged about 75 people. And then the last thing I said was, we're going to play the third version of zombie tag. And this time, if the original zombie tags you, you just simply stand in front of him. You can't tackle him, you can't hurt him, you can't punch him. You just got to keep him away from the other people. Never had this happen before in zombie tag, but 3 freshman boys from Vestavia Hills High School who weren't Christians read the rules of the game, and they just grabbed hands and made a circle around the zombie. And he didn't tag anybody but those 3 boys. They put themselves between the evil in their school. They did not try to be evil with evil. I get tagged, I tagged you, and because I tagged you, you tagged somebody else, and we're overcoming evil with evil. That's the only way the devil gets this stuff to propagate. He's not omniscient, he's not omnipresent. He can't be everywhere, so he's got to have help doing his work. And when I get hurt, I get wounded, I get traumatized, and I pass it on and hurt other people, that's how it spreads. Well, if somebody hurts you, and you're just a victim, and you just sit down and you quit and you cry, well, you're not doing any bad, but you're not doing any good. But at some point, as a spiritually mature person and a mentally healthy person, I initiate solutions to the problem. And I put myself between evil and the world. I put myself between evil in my family. I put myself between evil in my community. I put myself between evil. And once I initiate and decide I'm not a victim, and I don't have to pass it on, but I can make a difference. I believe that's the difference in being spiritually mature and mentally healthy versus being spiritually immature and being mentally unhealthy. Romans chapter 12, I think, is a good description of that. I've taken a little more time than they told me to. There are people who are teaching children who need to get out of those rooms, so I'm going to be done. Thank you guys for a good weekend. I hope this has been practical and scriptural and useful in your daily lives. God bless you all, and have a good day.
All right, let's close with a prayer and then let's go eat. Our Heavenly Father, thank you for allowing us to be here today. Thank you for Lonnie and the excellent lessons he's presented. Bless us as we leave this place. May we glorify and honor you in all that we think, say, and do. In Christ's name, amen.